I've probably seen that popular video about the Qing Dynasty declaring war on 8 countries.
今日庄严宣誓，向英吉利国开战，向法兰西国开战，向美利坚国开战，向德意志国开战，向俄罗斯国开战，向意大利国开战，向奥地利国开战，向日本国开战，钦此。
And you probably paused and asked the obvious question, why would any government choose to pick a fight with half the world at once? Why would a collapsing empire, already strained by internal unrest and foreign pressure, make a move that sounds almost suicidal on paper? And here's the twist. The way that Clip frames it is catchy. But it blurs 2 different things. The Qing Court S-1900 War Edict and the later 8-Nation Alliance label that made the number 8 stick in popular memory. Because if you zoom out for a second, declaring war on 8 countries sounds like a single, clean, intentional decision. Like a general in a strategy game clicking a button that says, declare war, and watching the map turn red. But history rarely works like that, and late Qing China definitely didn't. What happened in 1900 wasn't one rational actor calmly choosing the worst possible option. It was a government trapped inside a fast-moving crisis, trying to survive in a world that had already changed faster than its institutions could adapt. To understand the why, you have to first understand what people even mean when they say, the Qing declared war on 8 countries. There really was an Imperial Decree issued on June 21st, 1900, often translated as an Imperial Decree of declaration of war against foreign powers. But here's the detail that changes everything. That decree doesn't think to just name 8 states. It names 11, including Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So already the viral framing is compressing the story into a number that's easier to remember than the messier reality. So why do people keep saying 8? Because the 8 comes from the 8-Nation Alliance, the coalition that S most remembered for intervening militarily during the Boxer conflict. That alliance is commonly listed as Russia, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Japan, and the United States. In other words, the 8 is a label for the coalition that marched in, not a neat roster the Qing carefully selected in a single moment of theatrical bravado. But fine, let's grant the feeling behind the question. Even if the number is simplified, the spirit of the claim is still real. The Qing court did escalate to open war with major foreign powers in 1900. Why would they do that? Start with the environment the Qing were operating in. This was not a stable, confident superpower deciding whether to expand or not. This was an empire that had endured decades of foreign intrusion and domestic upheaval, and by 1900 it was dealing with a legitimacy crisis at home. Foreign influence wasn't some distant diplomatic issue. It was visible in ports, railways, concessions, and the daily reality of extraterritorial privileges, symbols that the Qing state could not fully enforce authority inside its own territory. Now add the Boxers. The Boxer movement didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew inside this environment of resentment, fear, and rumor. And it fed on the idea that foreign presence was not just exploitative, but existential. Once violence escalated, the situation became the kind of crisis where every decision creates new enemies, and every attempt to restore order risks being interpreted as betrayal by someone else. Here's the key political problem. The Qing court was caught between 2 fires. On one side were the foreign powers, demanding security for diplomats, missionaries, and citizens, and increasingly willing to use force when they didn't get it. On the other side were internal forces, popular anger, militant groups, local officials trying to keep control, and factions within the court itself that disagreed on whether compromise or confrontation was the path to survival. In that kind of situation, a declaration of war can function less like a rational military plan and more like a desperate political signal. It's the state loudly announcing, "We are not a puppet, we are not surrendering, we are choosing resistance." And when a government is losing credibility, symbolic acts become tempting, because symbolism is sometimes the only thing left that can be deployed quickly. You can't rebuild an economy overnight. You can't modernize an army in a month. You can't erase decades of humiliation with a policy memo, but you can issue an edict. That's why the viral framing feels plausible. It matches the emotional logic of desperation. When a system feels cornered, it may choose actions that look irrational from the outside, but feel necessary from the inside, because the alternative looks like slow death anyway. And remember, the Qing court war was an inyeti being declared against a single united enemy in the way modern states might imagine. It was being declared against a network of foreign powers whose presence in China was already backed by gunboats, treaties, and competing spheres of influence. So, from the court's perspective, the situation may not have looked like we are starting a new conflict, but more like the conflict is already here, and we're admitting it out loud. Then, the 8-nation alliance marches into the story. And this is where the narrative hardens into the number 8, because coalitions are easy to summarize. They have a name, they have a number, they have flags. They make for clean visuals and documentaries and thumbnails. And once you have a clean coalition label, people naturally reverse engineer the rest of the story to fit it. 8 nations fought China, therefore China declared war on 8 nations. It is not that the summary is completely false. Yes, that it is a compression that erases the messiest parts of the decision-making. But those messy parts are the entire point. Because the war edict wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was also an admission that the Qing state had lost the ability to manage the crisis through normal channels. Diplomacy had broken down. Local violence had outrun central control. Foreign militaries were already acting, and the court's choice, however it justified it, helped push the confrontation into a more total, less negotiable phase. And then comes the aftermath. The conflict ends not with a heroic reversal, but with punishment that would further weaken the Qing government's position. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 is one of the clearest signs of that outcome. Harsh terms, major costs, and yet another reminder that the empire could be compelled from the outside. That's the tragedy embedded in the viral line. Even if you grant the motive, defiance, survival, legitimacy, the result shows the asymmetry of power that had already been built into the international system surrounding China. So when the question is why, the answer isn't to one single motive like they were arrogant or they were foolish. It's a stack of pressures, foreign pressure that made the state look weak at home, internal unrest that made compromise look like surrender, a court divided between different survival strategies, with time running out, and a crisis spiraling so fast that symbolic action, like a sweeping war edict, could feel like the only way to seize the narrative. If this were a modern headline, it might read, "Government escalates to save face," and that sounds cynical. Until you remember that face in politics is often shorthand for legitimacy. And legitimacy is what keeps states from collapsing. For the Qing, legitimacy wasn't an abstract concept. It was the difference between holding an empire together and watching it fracture. That is why the real story behind the 8 countries' claim is more than a fact check. It is a case study in how empires react when they realize the old rules don't apply anymore. And it is also a case study in how the internet flattens complicated events into a single line, one that is easy to repeat, easy to visualize, and just inaccurate enough to hide the most important details. So here's the question to carry into the rest of the story. If the 8 countries line is a simplification, if the decree actually named more than 8, and the 8 comes from the alliance label, what else gets simplified when we tell the Boxer Rebellion as a quick morality play? Who gets turned into a single villain? Who gets turned into a single hero? And which uncomfortable realities get edited out because they don't fit in a 30-second clip? Because 1900 isn't just China versus the world. It's a collapsing order, a panicked court, a society boiling over, and foreign powers acting with their own agendas, all colliding at the worst possible moment. And once you see it that way, the war edict stops looking like a random act of madness and starts looking like something more disturbing, a predictable outcome of a system pushed past its breaking point.